So for Kaczynski, it seems his critique of technology is fundamentally a critique of technology from the perspective of the destruction of human dignity, and basically a critique of technology as alienation, or a critique of technology as existentially debilitating. For Kaczynski, technology is socially destabilizing, it's unfulfilling, it's degrading, it produces suffering, it's environmentally damaging. And if the techno-industrial system survives, for Kaczynski, it'll be at the, quote, cost of permanently reducing human beings and many other living organisms to engineered products and mere cogs in the social machine. And Kaczynski thinks that breaking down the system, whilst, itself will be quite painful and produce much suffering, on the whole, this will be far less painful than the outcome of continuing down the path of techno-industrial society where it's leading. Because although the techno-industrial system purports itself to be solving all of these problems and improving the quality of life of human beings in various ways, Kaczynski sees this technophilia as basically just ideology. He rejects it. And he basically says that we need to destroy it as soon as possible. He's like a revolutionary, because the longer that it goes on, the more painful it's going to be to destroy it, and the more painful it is the longer that it goes on as well. So he basically wants to just completely liquidate it, do away with it, and return to some kind of pre-technological society. But I don't think he actually means technology in the sense that many other authors of technology mean it. I mean, he has a very kind of loose definition. He makes a distinction later in the text between what he calls small-scale and organizational dependent technology, and it seems like he's fine with small-scale technology. He's not return to monkey or something, but almost like a return to feudal society kind of thing. Not necessarily return to feudalism, but the kind of technology they had like 1,000 years ago, he'd be fine with. He seems more concerned with the Industrial Revolution and its consequences, which he famously says he believes has been a disaster for the human race. So yeah, he is a revolutionary, but not merely a political revolutionary. Quote, "This is not to be a political revolution. Its object will not be to overthrow governments, but to overthrow the economic and technological basis of the present society." And he begins, funnily enough, and I found this bit quite enjoyable, with a critique of what he calls leftism, which he has a kind of interesting idiosyncratic definition of. Quote, "One of the most widespread manifestations of the craziness of our world is leftism. Leftist psychology, as he diagnoses, is apparently, according to Kaczynski, feelings of inferiority combined with over-socialization, and these two things come together to produce a collectivist mindset that wants to plan society and ultimately ends up affirming techno-industrialism. Quote, leftists tend to hate anything that has an image of being strong, good, and successful. They, quote, want society to solve everyone's problems for them, satisfy everyone's needs for them, take care of them. And so leftists then, for Kaczynski, are resentful towards the concept of competition because they feel like losers and have no confidence in being able to take care of themselves. Hence their preoccupation with sordid, depressive, or orgiastic modes of artistic expression, he explains, and their revulsion at any depiction of superiority or authority or success, which they feel the need to denigrate, as though success can have no legitimate moral basis. And so they have a hostile and often masochistic political expression and discourse. Quote, if our society had no social problems at all, the leftists would have to invent problems in order to provide themselves with an excuse for making a fuss. So for Kaczynski, the over-socialization of the leftist is a fundamental component of what makes them up, and it's a consequence of their feelings of guilt at being unable to live up to the impossible moral standards of contemporary society, where he says you aren't really allowed to hate anyone. So the leftist then feels the need to deceive themselves, quote, about their own motives and find moral explanations for feelings and actions that in reality have a non-moral origin. So he sees like it's purely natural to have hateful feelings, to have violent desires. The leftists, in trying to fit themselves into a totally unnatural, ridiculous moral code, they have to overreact with this hyper-ideologization of themselves. Quote, the over-socialized person is kept on a psychological leash and spends his life running on rails that society has laid down for him. And it is precisely this over-socialization that generates the sense of inferiority that drives the leftist's inferiority complex. And this is why the leftist never rebels against society really, for Kaczynski, but merely criticizes society only for failing to embody the principles it already nominally believes in and justifies itself on the base of. So the leftist then is a kind of Puritan defender of the established moral conventions. In other words, the values inherent to the contemporary techno-industrial system. Kaczynski also points out the necessity of goal-directed behavior to the human. Quote, leisured, secure aristocracies that have no need to exert themselves usually become bored, hedonistic, and demoralized, even though they have power. And this shows that power isn't enough. And so this means that elites either become decadent or they set up what he calls surrogate goals to pursue in order to maintain what he calls fulfillment in their life in spite of the techno-industrial system providing for their needs. He says biological needs have come to appear mundane to us in contemporary society in comparison to these surrogate activities which provide fulfillment, because meeting biological needs has now become trivialized because of how easy it is, and so we need to have some other mode of self-actualization made available to us to motivate us. Quote, more importantly, in our society, people do not satisfy their biological needs autonomously, but by functioning as parts of an immense social machine. So the only autonomy that is possible is this simulated artificial autonomy through surrogate activities. So for Kaczynski, if we are deprived of autonomous goal-directed activity, we become bored, demoralized, depressed, defeated, anxious, frustrated, hostile, and can fall into hedonism and abuse to cope, and we develop various disorders, self-esteem issues, and so forth. And he attributes all of this to the fact that, quote, society requires people to live under conditions radically different from those under which the human race evolved, and to behave in ways that contradict the patterns of behavior that the human race developed while living under earlier conditions. But it isn't just the degradation of autonomous self-actualization that does this for Kaczynski, but also the, quote, excessive population density, isolation of man from nature, excessive speed of social change, and the breakdown of the family, the village, and the tribe. So Kaczynski criticizes all of this, and criticizes conservatives for foolishly whining about the decline of traditional values whilst enthusiastically supporting technological progress and economic growth at the same time, which he sees as the driving force behind all of these changes. The techno-industrial system must liquidate what he calls small-scale communities in order to most effectively and efficiently function, and without them, traditional value transmission decays quite quickly, because obviously tradition is built out of these smaller scale communities, i.e. the family, the village, and the tribe. Quote, an advanced industrial society can tolerate only those small scale communities that are emasculated, tamed, and made into tools of the system. Quote, today people live more by virtue of what the system does for them or to them than by virtue of what they do for themselves. And what they do for themselves is done more and more along channels laid down by the system. Opportunities tend to be those that the system provides. The opportunities must be exploited in accord with rules and regulations and techniques prescribed by experts that must be followed if there is to be a chance of success. So it isn't just the lack of goals and autonomy, but also goals that he says are impossible, particularly security, providing security for oneself. Quote, our lives depend on decisions made by other people. We have no control over these decisions, and usually we do not even know the people who make them. So we are powerless then to secure our own lives, leaving us with this sense of being at the mercy of the techno-industrial system. Dependence is a very emasculating and dishonorable state. Quote, what makes us feel secure is not so much objective security as a sense of confidence in our ability to take care of ourselves. So the things which threaten the security of modern man cannot be just waved away stoically, anywhere near as easily as was possible in the classical world, as threats are basically man-made in the main, and imposed upon us not by chance, but by a technocratic elite, frustrating and humiliating us as mere dependents with no authority over the process. Quote, we can do anything we like so long as it is unimportant, but in all important matters, the system tends increasingly to regulate our behavior. And Kaczynski criticizes the notion that scientists give a shit about benefiting humanity, or that they are motivated by a sense of general curiosity. He believes they are motivated by the surrogate nature of their work to bring them a sense of self-actualization in what he calls the power process, which is essentially, as I said, it's self-actualization, it's setting goals, achieving goals. And he says, yeah, of course, like money and success do play a role in some cases, but ultimately, quote, science marches on blindly, without regard to the real welfare of the human race or to any other standard, obedient only to the psychological needs of the scientists and of the government officials and corporate executives who provide research funding. And so the freedom that is provided through these surrogate activities is artificial for Kaczynski. Quote, freedom means being in control of the life and death issues of one's existence. Food, clothing, shelter, and defense against whatever threats may be in one's environment. Freedom means having power. Not the power to control other people, but the power to control the circumstances of one's own life. And so he says basically human rights are delusions in advanced techno-industrial societies, overpowered by forces of mass media, bureaucracy, mass organization. It really doesn't matter if we have free speech, if the entire discourse is dominated by the industrialization of the media apparatus, where a small cartel of large corporations completely dominates mass consciousness. You can't compete with this. It completely infects the discourse everywhere you go. You end up absorbing the vernacular, things to pay attention to, just take your attention away from you. They stimulate you. They subvert your way of life, alter your way of thinking, and you don't really have the means to compete with this, or you protect yourself against this, really. If you're going to participate in society, you're kind of like a fish in water swimming in this environment where this massive industrial system is conditioning the way that you think and the way that you talk and the kind of social expectations around you. Anyway, so he then goes on to these, what he calls the principles of history, that contextualize why he thinks like radical revolutionary praxis is the only response to this that could be meaningful in any way. His first principle is that basically small changes are inconsequential towards long-term trends, because if you don't radically alter the system, you just make small reforms, ultimately you're not really changing the overall tendency of techno-industrial society. You're just messing with it in minor ways that don't really make much of a difference. And this then relates to the second principle, quote, "Society is a system in which all parts are interconnected and interrelated. You can't permanently change any important part without changing all other parts as well." And so this relates back to the first point in the key way, like, if you change one part but you don't change all the other parts, ultimately the overall logic of this interconnected multiplicity of the techno-industrial hyper-object is still going to continue functioning according to its fundamental structure and premises and logic. His third principle is that, quote, "If a change is made that is large enough to alter permanently a long-term trend, then the consequences for society as a whole cannot be predicted in advance." So that you have this non-linear complex system. We can't plan how it goes. It's almost like this paradox where by trying to plan all of society in this hyper-complex organized way, we create a system to try and plan society that becomes so complex that we can't actually plan how it functions and we lose control of it. His fourth postulate or principle is that, quote, "You cannot plan out a new form of society in advance and set it up and expect it to function as it was designed to do," which kind of follows from the previous point. And the fifth principle is that societies develop through processes of social evolution that are not under rational human control. So these points build on each other, and he makes the point that it's impossible to reform industrial technological society. Radical revolutionary action is the only praxis adequate to the task. Either we just go all out with it, and just continue down this path of radical dehumanization, the destruction of any kind of like natural basis for the human, total dissolution into collectivization and bureaucratization and technologization, or nuke the whole thing. He goes on this little tangent about how the American Revolution was ultimately fake and gay, basically. It didn't actually achieve what it said it was going to achieve, because it ended up reproducing the same fundamental political structure, more or less, that existed in Britain with only minor modifications. And so he kind of talks about how even revolutions don't work unless they make radical changes to the entire system, not just minor tweaks. Quote, "Permanent changes in favor of freedom could be brought about only by persons prepared to accept radical, dangerous, and unpredictable alteration of the entire system." So techno-industrial society for Kaczynski basically has to regulate human behavior closely in order to function. Bureaucracies have to be run according to rigid rules. It's just how they work. The system has to force people to behave in ways that are increasingly removed from the natural pattern of human behavior. And this is just how it has to function. There's no way of making techno-industrial society friendly and nice. Neoliberalism is a sham. There is no nice industrialization which preserves our humanity. Pick one. He says that mass organization basically simply requires decisions to be made which affect everyone. The system tries to solve this by propagandizing, a good term for this is to manufacture consent, because it's simply impossible to include everyone in the decision-making process. You've got millions of people. Decisions have to be made by someone. You're going to have a technocratic elite making these decisions. They can't participate in the process. Democracy is a delusion. You can try and get them to kind of want things that the technocratic elite have decided through mass engineering, some kind of legitimation propaganda process. Quote, "The system does not and cannot exist to satisfy human needs. Instead, it is human behavior that has to be modified to fit the needs of the system." He says ideological framing is relevant to this reality. And he kind of goes on about how in psychology and the production of new definitions and how psychology frames society, and the mind and the production of psychoactive drugs and the pharmaceutical industry with contemporary moral standards and ideologies and so forth, and like education techniques, how we live in a society of rigorous control. We're constantly being manipulated to fit into the system and into the system's internal logic as cogs in a machine. And this is, I think, backed up by, he doesn't really mention this, but backed up by the sociological framing and basically all what I would call the technocratic disciplines, like, political science, economics, and so forth. The way that they frame the political system for the political class to understand its role in society. Quote, "The concept of mental health in our society is defined largely by the extent to which an individual behaves in accord with the needs of the system and does so without showing signs of stress." So Kaczynski can see this quite clearly. For him, transhumanism is the inevitable destiny of techno-industrial society. Genetic modification and the complete augmentation of the human race by a technocratic elite is inevitable if we keep going down this road. Either we completely destroy techno-industrial society and return to what he calls nature. There's echoes of Rousseau in this sentiment, I think, in this affirmation of nature as giving to the human a different context than the technological and counterposing the two. But he says otherwise we're going to be completely stripped of our humanity, modified to kind of fit into this techno-industrial system as cogs that have no essential freedom or autonomy or individuated purpose, or even small-scale purpose or organization. He reiterates this anti-leftist stance. He says leftists, by virtue of their desire to plan things in order to kind of always defend the weak and the inferior with this collectivist mindset, they're always going to be allied with technology. They're always going to want to use technology to help people and protect the weak, protect the oppressed as they see it. And so there's no point collaborating with them. But he says we don't need to have a mass movement in order to achieve what he wants to achieve. He believes a small, concentrated, anti-technological movement is possible that could sabotage the techno-industrial system from within, using it against itself to blow it up and destroy it. It's a pretty, obviously, as you would expect from Ted Kaczynski, it's a pretty radical manifesto, pretty radical implications. But there's some interesting ideas here. But, with that, I'll throw it to Chris.